Hello and welcome to another episode of the Silk and Steel podcast. I'm your host, Carl Zha. Today, I have a very special guest, Ben Norton, who has been a friend of mine for a long time. We met in China, and who is also a very active geopolitics commentator. Now, for people who, for whatever reason, that still don't know you, Ben, they may be hiding under a rock or something. Could you just do a brief intro to what you do and who you are?
Yeah, I'm a journalist, but in recent years, I've been moving more and more toward kind of political economy. And I am the editor of the website Geopolitical Economy Report. It's at geopoliticaleconomy.com. And I report on and analyze a lot of issues related to, political economy and geopolitics. Especially, I've been focusing a lot on China and the new Cold War that the U.S. is waging on China. But also, I do focus a lot on Latin America because I lived in Latin America for many years. And every summer, I go back to Latin America. So I know today you wanted to talk about kind of all these related issues. And these are kind of the main things I focus on. And thanks for having me, Carl. I mean, it's great to see you.
This is the first time, your first time appearance on Silk and Steel podcast. So I'm quite honored to have you. So yes, let's just go straight to the topic. Right, recently, there seems to be, at least on surface, that there's a possible détente forming between United States and Russia over Ukraine, and with China over the geopolitical competition over East Asia. And there's even a RAND report about deprioritizing. There was a Pentagon leak about deprioritizing competition with China and focus on what they call quote unquote homeland, and what by which they really mean West Hemisphere, which include Latin America. But there's more recent development, because apparently the RAND report has been retracted. People find out it was gone. So what do you think all this means? Like, first of all, do you think there's a détente, a pending détente happening? And the second of all, we can pivot to talk about Latin America, why that Trump administration is choosing at this particular juncture to crank up the aggression toward Venezuela up to 11.
Yeah, well, those questions are directly related, so it makes sense. To answer your question briefly, I do not think there's a détente. I would say there's a change in strategy. And of course, every U.S. president is a war criminal, is an imperialist, but they sometimes had different strategies. And if you look in Trump's first term, he continued the new Cold War against China that really started under Obama. A lot of people claim it started under Trump in his first term. It was Obama and the so-called pivot to Asia when Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State. And originally, the U.S. tried to have what they called a Russia reset. Hillary Clinton met with Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. She brought a red button with the mistranslated Russian phrase. And they said they wanted a reset because they wanted to prioritize containment of China. They could see that China was growing extremely fast with double-digit GDP growth, moving up the value chain, becoming a technological power, and they wanted to prevent China from overtaking the U.S. And that failed for a variety of reasons, especially because the situation with Russia only got worse with the U.S.-backed coup in Ukraine in 2014, and then the annexation of Crimea, which historically had been part of Russia, and then the war in Ukraine that the U.S. set off in the eastern part of Ukraine, escalating sanctions on Russia. All of that only made it more difficult for the U.S. to try to bring about this Kissingerian triangulation strategy of breaking apart Russia and China. It pushed Russia and China closer together. And then with the new phase of the Ukraine war in 2022, we now see that there's no way within our lifetimes for decades, there's no way that the U.S. is going to be able to ally with Russia against China. Russia and China now are very close partners. So that strategy starting under Obama and continuing in the first Trump administration, going into Biden, that clearly failed. But what's interesting is when Trump came in his first term, he obviously did try to improve relations with Russia, which explains this nonsense Russiagate, operation which, you and I were always very skeptical about. It was obviously always nonsense, but ironically, this Russiagate paranoia also prevented the US from improving relations with Russia, which ended up being good for China. And then when Biden came in, some very naive people thought that Biden would be softer on China because Trump had started the trade war in China in his first term. And again, he kind of accelerated the new Cold War in China that started under Obama. But actually, when Biden came in, he was also very hawkish against China in a slightly different way. So, for instance, Trump applied more blanket tariffs on China, whereas Biden's trade war on China was much more targeted. It was more of a tech war, targeting the high-tech sectors in China, what they call the three new things, the Xinjiang, the three most important industries that are now, that China is the world leader in, which are solar panels, electric vehicles, and batteries, especially lithium-ion batteries and other batteries. Those were the sectors targeted by the Biden White House with tariffs of 50 to 100%. So today it's almost impossible to get a Chinese EV in the US, even though they make the best EVs in the world. And there are more than 100 Chinese companies making EVs, including some state-owned companies like Chang'an. But of course, BYD has become the juggernaut. It's now the world's #1 producer and exporter of EVs. And they're much cheaper, as in much lower cost than Teslas, and they're better quality. I've been in many Chinese EVs here because, anytime you take a Didi, like a taxi, they're almost all EVs at this point, especially in the tier 1 cities like Beijing and Shanghai. So Chinese EVs are amazing, and they're being exported to countries around the world, not the US. The US does have Tesla, by the way. Slightly over half, a slight majority of all Teslas are made in China, especially in the Shanghai mega factory. But anyway, and we now see European companies are saying that they want to make their EVs in China because it's the only way to make them competitive. But anyway, getting back to this to answer your question about this narrative of the new Cold War in China and how it's evolved. So Biden continued this war, but in a different way. It was more targeted at the high-end sector in China. And Biden's Commerce Secretary, Gina Raimondo, said that the U.S. strategy was to prevent China from innovating, to prevent China from catching up technologically, which, also J.D. Vance made a similar comment recently. J.D. Vance is, of course, the U.S. vice president under Trump in his second term. Vance gave a speech at this venture capital conference in Washington, D.C., backed by Andreessen Horowitz. These are billionaire venture capitalists in Silicon Valley who are very pro-Trump. And he complained that when the U.S. allowed China into the U.S.-dominated international financial system and allowed China to join the World Trade Organization, the WTO, in 2001, it was under the impression that China would always be subservient, that China would provide cheap labor to manufacture goods that were designed by U.S. corporations. He mentioned, for instance, the iPhone. He said very clearly something that, critics of neoliberal globalization have been saying for a long time, and not just me, other people, that the point of neoliberal globalization was trapping China into this international division of labor so U.S. corporations would provide the most high value-added services that are the most profitable, like designing the iPhone, designing chips and things like that, and they would be physically manufactured by Chinese workers. They didn't want Chinese companies to also design chips and also design computers and electric vehicles and all these things. So it would keep Chinese people trapped permanently much lower in the totem pole, subservient to the US. And of course, China did not want that. The Chinese government prioritized its industrial policy, moving up the value chain, creating its own technological giants, which are all now being sanctioned and tariffed by the US. So this brings us to Trump 2. In fact, I was just reading this morning, Reuters reported that the Pentagon is pushing to add several other major Chinese tech giants to the entity list, which would be a form of sanctions on Chinese companies. They already did this to Huawei to try to destroy Huawei. They, they forced Canada to kidnap Meng Wanzhou, the CFO of Huawei and the daughter of the founder of Huawei, which was a major act of aggression against China, targeting its most important tech company. And people in the West may know, Huawei makes phones and computers, but they make everything. I mean, Huawei is this massive company that is in every major high-end tech industry, including electric vehicles, by the way, they've been trying to do, but also semiconductors. Huawei is challenging NVIDIA, trying to design very high value added chips and to break that monopoly that NVIDIA has. Anyway, now after going after Huawei, the Pentagon under Trump, Pete Hegseth, the more accurately named Department of War, is pushing to put Alibaba and BYD and Baidu on the list, the entity list. I mean, these are like the biggest Chinese tech companies. So this all fits into this argument that I do not think we're seeing a détente. I think we're seeing a shift in strategy, and we're still going to see more sanctions, more tariffs. I think in the very short term, maybe for a year, the U.S. has decided that it can't continue with more tariffs on China because China was able to defend itself, unlike any other country. Trump in April, on his so-called Liberation Day, he announced these sky-high tariffs on countries around the world, and basically no country was able to defend itself. China was the only country that had the capacity to do so. The U.S. hit China with tariffs. China hit back with proportional tariffs. And at a few points, the tariffs on China, the U.S. tariffs, were over 140%, which is absurd. That's just a trade embargo. And then China, in response to the U.S. levying more export restrictions on China, especially of high-end chips, China responded with the restriction of the export of rare earth metals and magnets, which are extremely important for the industrial supply chain for high-tech products in the U.S. and especially for the military-industrial complex. So rare earths are needed in cars and computers and things like that, but they're also needed in weapon systems and missiles. So the U.S. military-industrial complex, which is making all these weapons to prepare for a potential future war with China, needs rare earths produced by China. China restricted the export of those rare earths, and China dominates the global supply chain. So these factors forced the U.S. to take a step back, and essentially Trump, with this agreement that he made with President Xi Jinping in South Korea in October, they took a step back to where the situation was when Trump came into office. The tariff level on China is still pretty high, but it's where it was when Trump entered. So overall, I mean, I think the strategy that the U.S. government has recognized that they cannot actually escalate in the short term because it will cause too much damage to the U.S., especially economically, in the short term. So they need to prepare for the medium to the long term to have a strategy of decoupling. This is this term that in Washington they constantly use, they're obsessed with. And I think that is what they're trying to do, genuinely, is to decouple economically from China. If you look at China's exports to the U.S., 20 years ago, they were extremely high. And in general, China's exports as a share of GDP was higher than the global average 20 years ago. Today, it's actually lower than the global average, which if you read the Western financial press, you might be surprised to hear that. China does still depend on exporting a lot of technological goods, but you look at pretty much every other industry, and the vast majority of Chinese products are purchased and consumed domestically because it has a big market, a massive market of 1.4 billion people. But China does still rely on exporting some tech products, and the U.S. market has become less and less important. 5 years ago, it was nearly 15% of China's exports. Now it's probably around 11% as of this year and dropping more and more. China's largest trading partner now is actually not the US or even Europe. It's actually ASEAN, the Southeast Asian countries. So what we're seeing is gradually China and the US move toward this decoupling. You can never have full decoupling, but instead it will be their trade and their supply chains will be rerouted through other countries. So the US is trying to friend-shore and near-shore the supply chain. So instead of making iPhones in China, they're trying to make iPhones unsuccessfully in India and move a lot of that production into Vietnam, where they're having much more success. Because Vietnam, basically has the same system as China. They're very similar. China's system is a socialist market economy, as it's called. Vietnam system is called a socialist-oriented market economy. They're both run by Communist Party, very similar system. And Vietnam has kind of borrowed from a lot of China's experience in the reform and opening up to use industrial policy, state-led in planning and investment to move up the global supply chain and make more manufacturing at the higher end of the supply chain. So, I mean, we're going to see this stuff happen over time. But what really happened is that the US economically realized that it's actually more dependent on China than vice versa. So the more the US escalates, it actually causes more damage to the US. So in this kind of game theory scenario, the US has to take a step back and be a little more cautious and move a little bit more toward short-term de-escalation in order to prepare for medium-term escalation again. And then the military element is part of this as well. You know, if you look at any Pentagon war games exercise, and they've done many with China, they found that they lose in almost every scenario, or even in the so-called best case scenario, as reported by Politico, both sides lose. China and the US are devastated in any kind of war. So, I mean, these people in the Pentagon, these war planners, they see the situation and they say, well, it's not realistic for us. First of all, both sides have nuclear weapons. Even if they could have some kind of direct conflict, which seems less and less likely given that situation with nuclear weapons, it seems more likely there would be some kind of proxy war where the US uses the Philippines and Japan to try to wage a proxy war against China, maybe in the South China Sea, or who knows. Even that is looking more and more untenable, more difficult. So I think what in the Pentagon they've come to accept is that they have to go back to a kind of Cold War strategy where it's not détente, but instead of escalating too much that could risk a conventional war that would bring about extreme destruction and potentially nuclear war, they have to find a way to use third parties to escalate. And it's going to look, I mean, it's looking more and more like the first Cold War. I'm not saying it's exactly the same as the first Cold War, but in the first Cold War, starting roughly around 1945 until 1991, you know, détente wasn't until the 1980s. And then by that time, the Soviet Union was on the verge of collapsing, right? China is nowhere looking, it's not in any situation even remotely close. In fact, the US is much more unstable than the Chinese government right now. So I wouldn't compare it to détente. I would say it's kind of the early stages of the Cold War where they've recognized that a hot war is not feasible. So they want to figure out how to continue to put pressure on China, but to do so without increasing the backlash against the US.
Now, before we move to the next topic on US pivot to Latin America, I kind of want to dig in this topic a little more. What is the logic of decoupling? Why would US push for decoupling from China when, you know, for a while, it looks like US multinationals were also profiting from trading with China? I mean, that's why they move a lot of the production to China in the first place. So why now to try to reverse that process and try to decouple from the Chinese supply chain?
Yeah, well, it depends which multinational corporations, right? Because there were some that relied especially on Chinese labor that were manufacturing intensive. But now a lot of these companies want protectionism. They don't want to compete with China because they can't compete with China, especially the tech companies, right? This is why they're trying to ban TikTok. It's why they're trying to ban BYD. In fact, Elon Musk, if you look at most of the big billionaires in the US, Elon Musk is one of the very few who's actually involved in manufacturing. The vast majority of these tech billionaires, they don't actually make products. They make software or they make AI models or whatever. There are a few that make the actual technological goods. They're terrified of competition from China. So Elon Musk, for instance, even when Biden was president, he went on an earnings call with Tesla shareholders, and he said very clearly that if there are no tariffs and protectionist measures levied against BYD, BYD will destroy Tesla. And like 2 months after he said that, the Biden White House put 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs. So, I mean, this is obvious. I mentioned this speech that JD Vance gave where he complains about, you know, iPhones. I mean, look at how is Apple going to, first of all, move its production out of China. It's very difficult. It's trying to move it to India. It's very difficult to do. But even if it can succeed in doing that, I mean, the only way that that Apple will continue to be able to continue competing with Huawei and Honor and Xiaomi and there are literally dozens of Chinese phone companies that make very good, much cheaper phones. And you're in Southeast Asia. I'm sure everyone there is using Honor, Xiaomi, like it's all Chinese phones. Yeah. But like even average people, like Redmi is like the Xiaomi cheaper version and stuff. Like there's no way that like there will be a few like hipsters who are insist on buying an iPhone even though it's 3 times more expensive. But like the only way these US and European companies will be able to compete is through protectionist measures, is through very heavy tariffs. And which ironically is what the US always accused China of. China did have high tariffs in the 70s and 80s and the early 90s as it was, in the beginning their reform and opening up, but it had to remove most of those tariffs by the time it joined the World Trade Organization in 2001. But anyway, the point is that those companies are deathly afraid of Chinese competition. But there were certainly other companies that when China didn't have competitors, they loved investing in China because they could simply exploit lower paid Chinese workers who were very skilled, very well educated, thanks to all of the policies. I mean, people love to talk about the reform and opening up, which of course was very important in China's development. But even going back to the Mao era, people like to erase all of that. But that's why the Chinese population was very well educated, was well clothed and fed, and had basic infrastructure. And then the reform and opening up built upon that. India never had that kind of revolutionary experience. There's still hundreds of millions of people in India who are illiterate, who don't have enough food, who don't have access to water and electricity. All of that basic infrastructure and human capital development was already, that base was set in the Mao era. So when Deng Xiaoping initiated the reform and opening up in 78, they had all of the necessary infrastructure and education levels and all of that in order to have this very skilled, educated workforce. And at first, yes, they were working for these foreign companies, but China knew they didn't want to just stay at this lower level in the supply chain. They wanted to make their own tech companies and their own firms that could actually challenge these Western monopolies. So I think, there's this idea that from 20 years ago that all these US multinationals loved investing in China. Well, I think the situation today is quite different. I haven't even talked about, the financial sector in the US, which also, they're very, these days, I mean, there have been like ebbs and flows, but these days they're very bearish on the Chinese financial sector. They are very skeptical about the Chinese financial sector because China's financial sector is state-owned. It has capital controls. So now getting back to this idea of decoupling that you asked about. Decoupling, I think, why does the US want to do this? Well, obviously, because if you're preparing for more and more conflict, even if it's not a direct conventional war, if you're going to have more conflict, the US is going to impose only more and more sanctions in the future. I mean, come on, like this idea that there will be fewer sanctions is absurd. And in order to prepare for that situation and to minimize the backlash, the blowback on the US economically, they have to decouple more and more. This is the issue with the whole rare earth issue, right? Because the US now recognizes that it can't escalate as much as it would like to because it would actually cause more damage to the US than it would cause to China, right? So if the US can decouple, and this is why the US Congress, the House Committee on China, this crazy anti-China committee that Marco Rubio was a key part of, they published a report detailing the U.S. plan to develop a new supply chain for critical minerals to try to remove China from that supply chain and many other sectors. I mean, I mentioned, iPhones and all of these technological products that are still made in China. They're trying to move them to other countries so that 5-10 years from now, when they hit China with more sanctions, and eventually they're going to do to China what they've done to Russia. I mean, it's inevitable. They're going to do that. They're going to try to disconnect Chinese banks from the SWIFT system. This is why China is quietly but gradually developing its alternative to SWIFT, which is called CIPS, CIPS. And, China, one major difference between China and Russia is Russia loves to like boast about all of the ways it's resisting the West and standing up to the US and then kind of beat their chest, which is cool. I mean, I respect that. Like, we need that. China's the opposite. China always it's very humble, and it's the Deng Xiaoping strategy of maintain a low profile, bide your time, right? Lie low and bide your time. So China is doing a lot of this stuff, but it doesn't talk about it publicly. It's very quiet. But China is developing these financial alternatives. It's de-dollarizing its foreign exchange reserves. It's massively buying lots and lots of gold. A lot of this is not officially reported in the reports from the People's Bank of China, the Chinese central bank, but we've seen reports in like the Financial Times and Bloomberg that China is just stockpiling all of this gold and reducing its holdings of U.S. Treasury securities, preparing for more sanctions. I mean, the decoupling is necessary for the further escalation. This is why, again, I don't see any evidence of détente. I see evidence of a de-escalation in the short term to prepare for more medium to long-term escalation to minimize the blowback on the U.S.
And you mentioned tech companies and Jason, and that actually reminds me, a lot of the very hardcore China hawks in US are these Silicon Valley tech bros like Palantir. Palantir co-founder Alex Karp is one of the hardcore China hawks, but really a lot of their rhetorics strike me as they're just trying to expand their grip, because their whole line is, you have to give us $500 billion of investment because we cannot let China win. That's why, you must give $500 billion to the Stargate project, or you have to give us $1 trillion to build data centers because China cannot win. I mean, that's like literally their only selling point is you have to blow up this AI bubble because we cannot have China develop Terminator and Skynet first. We got to be the first to do that. So yeah, I think there's definitely that at play. Now, what?
One quick note, Carl. So OpenAI, this is the most influential U.S. AI company. It's a private company, but it's largely owned by Microsoft. Microsoft has a very big stake in it. And OpenAI's CEO, of course, OpenAI makes ChatGPT. OpenAI's CEO, Sam Altman, this, billionaire tech bro from Silicon Valley, he has been lobbying hard to ban DeepSeek and now Kimi and all of the other Chinese AI models. First of all, they're open source, which is terrifying these US AI companies because their whole business model is operating at a loss for several years and then establishing a monopoly and then charging very high monopoly rents, massively increasing the prices. This is the Uber business model, right? Uber was losing money for most of its history. It destroyed most of its competitors, got over 70% market share, and then massively increased prices of taxis. This is what OpenAI wanted to do. And obviously, China's open source models prevent so-called OpenAI from having that. It should be called closed AI. And then furthermore, I don't know if you saw that OpenAI published a letter recently, an open letter to a US government institution in Washington that oversees like technology policy and investment. And they begged the US government for more investment from the Pentagon in particular. And the entire letter is framed about we have to stop China. And this is why the government, one, should back OpenAI's loans. In case they can't pay their loans, the government should pay them. And two, they should invest in the energy grid and data centers on behalf of OpenAI because China. And they talk about the so-called Electron gap with China, which is reminiscent in the first Cold War of the missile gap with the Soviet Union. Then I said we have an electron gap with China because China's electricity capacity is now almost double that of the US and massively growing. So all of these, not all of them, but many of these tech companies are framing the reason that they're using the new Cold War as an opportunity to ask the US government to protect them and to ban their Chinese competitors. OpenAI literally called for banning Chinese AI models, claiming that they're government backed and they're going to be used to spy on people, like the TikTok rhetoric, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of projection when in the U.S. discourse about China. Now I want to move on to our next topic, which is why while U.S. have come to realize that limits the resource limitation on its pursuit of global hegemony, particularly in a more kinetic situation versus Russia or China. Why then they decide to pivot, so-called, to more aggression toward Venezuela? Because we know U.S. had always had a hate boner for Venezuela, because ever since Hugo Chavez came to power and trying to assert Venezuelan sovereignty, U.S. always had a hate boner against the government in Venezuela. But why did they decide to crank up that aggression up to 11 at this particular juncture?
Yeah, well, look back at the first Cold War, Cold War I, and the U.S. recognized that it could not wage a direct war with the Soviet Union. So it went around trying to destabilize any potential allies of the Soviet Union to try to encircle the Soviet Union and weaken it. The same strategy now, right? So the U.S. is going after China's allies and partners, trying to weaken and destabilize them in order to try to isolate China. We see this certainly in the Asia Pacific region, like with the Philippines being a classic example. The previous Philippine president, Duterte, was much more pro-China. He's now being, going through this kangaroo court, which is completely absurd. The current extremely corrupt oligarch leader of the Philippines, Bongbong Marcos, the son, he's, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., the son of Ferdinand Marcos Sr., the US-backed dictator who was a brutal dictator. He ruled with an iron fist, killed thousands of people in the Philippines. He was a key U.S. ally in the first Cold War. His son now is another U.S. proxy, and he's allowing the U.S. to establish new military bases in the northern part of the Philippines with offensive missile systems aimed at the Chinese mainland that can hit most major cities in the Chinese mainland, as far as Chongqing, and that's where you're from. I mean, it's crazy, over 2,000 kilometers in these missile systems called the Typhoon missile systems. So, I mean, the U.S. is trying to, in every country surrounding China, India, which is it's not very successful there, in Southeast Asia, certainly with Japan and South Korea, it's trying to encircle China, and then it's going to other regions and trying to destabilize China-friendly governments. Obviously, probably the closest ally of China or partner of China in Latin America is Venezuela. And of course, Venezuela has very large oil reserves. I mean, I always point out when we're doing geopolitical analysis, it's never just one reason, right? Like, for instance, the war in Iraq was not just about oil, but ignoring the oil factor is, of course, also very naive. Like, there's a multitude of factors here. In the case of Venezuela, well, let me start with Latin America in general, then I'll get to Venezuela. So the U.S. strategy, again, I've talked about how the U.S. recognizes that in the short term, it can't continue to escalate too much against China without causing more backlash, more blowback on the U.S. So they need to find ways to decouple and ways to provide opportunities for more escalation in the medium term against China. So right now, the strategy is solidifying U.S. hegemony across the entire Western Hemisphere. This is the neo-colonial or the old school colonial Monroe Doctrine, which is a 202-year-old colonial doctrine that essentially says that all of Latin America and all of the Western Hemisphere is part of the U.S. imperial sphere of influence. And the U.S. empire should control everything that happens in this region. And specifically, the Monroe Doctrine was very insidious because, the U.S. has always been a clever empire. Unlike the traditional European empires, which were proud of the fact they were an empire, they boasted of it. The British Empire boasted that it was so big that there was always a part of the empire where the sun was rising. The sun never set in the British Empire. Whereas the U.S. has always been an empire that claims not to be an empire, right? So the Monroe Doctrine originally was the U.S. empire as it was beginning to establish itself and expanding territorially, not only to the West, by stealing the land of indigenous Americans, Native Americans, but also moving to the South. So the Monroe Doctrine was issued in 1823. In 1846, the U.S. invaded Mexico in an illegal war of aggression, and they colonized the northern half of Mexico, which, by the way, are today some of the areas with the largest oil reserves and natural resource reserves, including two of the biggest states in the US economy, California and Texas, which were part of Mexico, stolen from Mexico. So as the US declared the so-called Monroe Doctrine, it was territorially expanding its empire, and it was a clever colonial strategy because the US said, we're going to protect these independent republics in Latin America who just earned their independence from Spanish and Portuguese colonialism. We're going to protect them. Of course, that's absurd. The US was not protecting them. It was replacing the Spanish and the Portuguese colonialists as the new colonialists. And today, actually, the Monroe Doctrine is kind of cited in a very similar way. The US says, we're protecting the region from China and Russia and Iran and their nefarious meddling. And the US says, China and Russia cannot meddle in Latin America. Only we can meddle in Latin America, right? So this is the strategy. And then, of course, resources are part of this, but it's also kind of just more solidifying this entire geographic region and also preventing any of these countries from being potential Chinese allies if there is a future war with China, right? So, like, for instance, if there's a war with China, Venezuela would probably allow Chinese or Russian forces to use Venezuelan territory, right? So the U.S. is trying to solidify imperial control over the entire region. Now, in terms of Greenland, which is the Panama Canal is obvious. Trump wants to colonize that, and this is for trade. Clearly, he says China controls it. It's not true. China does not control the Panama Canal. There were some Chinese companies that were invested in ports on different sides of the canal, but they were not run by China. They were not run by the Chinese government, certainly. And Trump is trying to force it's actually a Hong Kong company, but it's still Chinese. Trump was trying to force this Hong Kong company to divest from its investments in Panama, and instead BlackRock was going to buy them up. And when Trump announced this in Congress, he conveniently didn't mention which company it was, BlackRock. He said a US company bought it. Anyway, so, Panama is very important in terms of international trade, and he wants to block that off to China, but also Greenland. Greenland is important, one, because it has a lot of critical minerals that the US wants to replace its dependence on China for critical minerals in the supply chain. And as climate change leads to, rising global temperatures, it's going to start to melt some of the ice in the Arctic, and it's going to make it easier for ships to go through the Arctic and near Greenland. So the US already has a military base in Greenland. They want to colonize it, militarize it further, and exploit its critical minerals. So these issues are all related to kind of preparation, strengthening the US empire, strengthening its control over key commodities, natural resources, critical minerals, to make its own kind of supply chain within Latin America. And another part of this, by the way, is exploiting cheap labor in Latin America, because the US wants to reindustrialize. Trump says that, but they're not going to do that realistically in the US. It's not going to happen. We're actually seeing the number of manufacturing jobs in the US falling under Trump. And so what they're going to have to do realistically is friend-shore. A lot of that's going to Mexico, but they want to send it also to other parts of Latin America. They want to send it to like Argentina, Chile, maybe Ecuador, although Ecuador is becoming a failed state under these US puppet leaders, where they can pay people, 1/5 of what US workers would be paid, even less. And yet these would be US companies. I mean, doing what they did to China, but the difference is they're going to make sure that there are these puppet governments that are these complete neoliberal libertarians like Javier Milei in Argentina, who are going to end all state support, end all industrial policy. Argentina is deindustrializing very rapidly as we speak. So they'll invest and try to make Teslas in Argentina or something. And then the Argentine government's never going to actually have planning and industrial policy to develop competitors to Tesla like China did. So they'll just keep these countries trapped in like the lower part of the supply chain. So they just want to recreate this entire region and use it as a base of operations as they prepare and try to strengthen the US for more confrontation with China. Now, where does Venezuela fit in this? Obviously, Venezuela has the largest oil reserves. I mean, the US, by the way, is the world's largest producer and exporter of oil. This is a huge change in the past 10 years, one of the biggest geopolitical shifts. The US produces more oil than Saudi Arabia and Russia. And that figure has only increased. It massively increased under Obama. He boasted about this. It increased under Trump in his first term. It increased under Biden. And the US is now the biggest producer of natural gas and a major exporter of LNG, liquefied natural gas, which is now going to Europe because they're not buying cheap pipeline gas from Russia. So it's not like the US needs Venezuela's oil, but of course, US corporations would love to exploit Venezuela's oil. They've been trying for many decades after it was nationalized. And then if they can control the oil reserves in Venezuela, they would definitely go after Colombia and Trinidad and Tobago. They already basically at this point are controlling the US threats in the Caribbean. It's not only against Venezuela, they're threatening Caribbean countries. So, and then Brazil is kind of the last domino to fall in this US imperial strategy. Brazil is a major oil producer. It's a major ally of China. It's a founding member of BRICS. So, I mean, the Americas, from North to South America, all the way down, all of the resources in this region are off the charts. Some of the biggest oil producers in the world, the US, Canada, Colombia, Trinidad and Tobago as also gas producer, Venezuela, Brazil, natural gas producers. It's crazy. Gold. So that's the US strategy. And then also to starve China of those resources. Venezuela is a major ally of China. And of course, the vast majority of Venezuela's oil exports go to China. Now, China can probably do without Venezuela. Venezuela only produces around 1 million barrels of oil per day. But, the idea is for the entire Americas to try to prevent the Americas to reduce all of its trade with China. China still actually has a lot of trade with Brazil. Brazil's largest trading partner by far is China. And China imports a lot of iron ore from Brazil and oil, and also soybeans and beef. And this is true for South America in general. The largest trading partner of South America is China. And the largest trading partner of all of Latin America, excluding Mexico, is China. And that relationship is increasing over time. Many Latin American countries are joining the Belt and Road Initiative. And the largest port in largest port in Latin America just opened, which is the port of Chancay in Peru, which it was invested heavily by China. It's a joint Peruvian-Chinese port, but the major Chinese, it was built by Chinese state-owned construction companies, and one of the main operators is COSCO, not to be confused with Costco, like the U.S. company. COSCO is the Chinese state-owned shipping giant. So Latin America is becoming more important for China's trade, and Latin America in the past few decades has become more and more independent of the U.S. empire. So the U.S. strategy is to try to solidify more control, and this would also be a threat to other countries in the global south, especially Africa, saying you cannot have close relations with China. We're in a new Cold War. We're not going to allow you to be non-aligned. The U.S. is going to try to force countries to say you have to pick a side. You're either with us or against us, as George Bush said. And Venezuela is this country that, first of all, again, given all the resources, it would be very strategic, but also symbolically, it would be a massive blow to, first of all, the entire Latin American left. If Venezuela falls, almost certainly Cuba will fall. And then the U.S. would probably also try to overthrow the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. And then any other left-wing government in Latin America would be immediately threatened. Brazil is the real prize, but that's much more difficult. They tried to do that by imprisoning Lula on fake charges in 2018 and putting Bolsonaro in power. But, Brazil has been able to, Lula has been very clever, and they were able to take action against Bolsonaro because of the coup attempt and all of this. But the strategy is to go to these different regions, to weaken all of the independent countries that are Chinese allies, to destabilize them, to impose hegemonic control, and then to send a message to other countries that they'll be next to try to isolate China.
Well, thank you for connecting all the dots. I can just sit here and listen to you for hours. I'm just asking you to speculate now. Given the current U.S. military buildup in the region, particularly in the Caribbean, do you think there's a realistic chance for U.S. military action against Venezuela, or is this just act of bluffing? It's Trump just trying to intimidate some kind of regime change to take place in Venezuela by flexing U.S. military muscles?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's the $1 billion question. No one knows exactly what the strategy is. Trump loves to do this kind of madman strategy like Richard Nixon, but I honestly think that it's likely that yes, there will be further U.S. military action and escalation. I mean, the first thing I'll say to your question is there already is U.S. military action. The U.S. has already killed dozens of Venezuelans and some Colombians and Trinidadians in these strikes in the Caribbean. And of course, this is completely bogus. This idea that it's because of drug trafficking, totally false. This is the new WMDs narrative, the weapons of mass destruction lie that the U.S. used to justify the illegal invasion of Iraq. We know that was false. Now what they're saying falsely is that Venezuela's president, Nicolás Maduro, is the head of a so-called drug cartel that they call the Cartel de los Soles, the Suns cartel, because the Venezuelan military has like a sun patch on their uniform. Totally absurd. First of all, even mainstream analysts in Western think tanks funded by Western governments have admitted that this so-called Suns cartel does not exist. It was made up. It's being pushed by the Trump administration and the far-right Venezuelan opposition, which is backed by the U.S., led by these people like Maria Corina Machado, this far-right extremist who is very pro-war, and yet she won the so-called Nobel Peace Prize, along with, war criminals like Henry Kissinger and Barack Obama, and the CIA asset the Dalai Lama and other U.S. government-funded operatives. So she is working with Marco Rubio very closely to try to justify more and more military attacks in Venezuela. Now, during Trump's first term, let's not forget, Trump launched another coup attempt in Venezuela, and this was using this puppet, Juan Guaido. And in fact, I remember, Carl, that I've been to Venezuela several times. I remember one time I interviewed you in Venezuela. We were talking about China and Venezuela relations in 2019 during that coup attempt. So that that was, a lot of people were scared. Obviously, that it failed, but a lot of people in Venezuela were very scared that there would be a U.S. invasion. And Marco Rubio was pushing for a U.S. invasion at that time. Also, I should point out, I have an article about this on my website, geopoliticaleconomy.com, that Trump's defense secretary, Mark Esper, a former VP of Raytheon turned defense secretary, now he would be known as Secretary of War, more appropriately. Mark Esper, after he left the first Trump administration, he wrote a memoir, and in it, he admitted that they talked about military attacks on Venezuela. They discussed potential options, including of an invasion, including missile strikes or airstrikes. They didn't do the airstrikes, but let's not forget, there was an attempted invasion of Venezuela backed by the Trump administration that people jokingly called Bay of Piglets. This was in May 2020. It was called Operation Gideon, and it was led by U.S. Special Operations Forces, Green Berets from the U.S. Army, allegedly former Green Berets, but I mean, come on. And they trained these forces, these mercenaries, Colombian and Venezuelan mercenaries in northern Colombia, and then they took a boat into Venezuela and tried to invade, but they were actually caught by a union of left-wing Venezuelan fishermen who supported the government, and they informed the authorities, and the authorities found these mercenaries and arrested them. And this was overseen by this U.S. mercenary company based in Florida called Silver Corps, which was owned by another U.S. Special Operations Forces official named Jordan Goudreau, who was then screwed over by the Trump administration. What happens is when you work for the CIA like this and your operation fails, they abandon you. I mean, we've seen this so many times throughout history, right? They throw you under the bus, and the CIA said, oh, we don't know who this guy is. We have nothing to do with him. And he faced all these legal issues, and then he tried to sue the Trump administration because he was like, he admitted, we were going to Florida and meeting with Trump administration officials. We were working with the CIA, and then it all failed, and they just abandoned us and pretend like they had no idea who we were. This is the idea of, plausible deniability. So the reason I mention all that history is that, like, we've seen this story before, right? What they're doing is they recognize that the first time it failed, so they just need to go straight to the military option, which is why I do think we're going to see further escalation of the military attacks, especially now that, Marco Rubio is not officially in the first Trump administration. He had Trump's ear as an advisor, but now Marco Rubio is the second most powerful person in the US government after Donald Trump himself. Rubio is the second person in US history to simultaneously serve as both the Secretary of State, the head of foreign policy, that is, and the head of the National Security Council, the National Security Advisor. The only other person in US history who simultaneously held both positions was Henry Kissinger. And look how powerful Kissinger was in the Nixon administration. So Marco Rubio is obsessed with this. This is his lifelong mission. This is like his entire career has been dedicated to overthrowing the Cuban government and then the Venezuelan government. And then after that, the Nicaraguan government. Like, he's from Miami, Florida. This is like, if he can pull this off, he will be the next US president, because like Florida will just like, they will worship Marco Rubio in Florida. In Miami, like everything will be named after him. They will have statues on every corner of Marco Rubio if he can pull this off. I don't think he'll pull it off, but he thinks he can. Like, he's not going to lose this opportunity. So the question is, what will they do? I don't think that Trump will agree to send troops, at least large numbers of troops. I think he would agree to send special operations forces. He's already admitted to authorizing CIA covert operations. Now, come on. The idea that the CIA was not already active in Venezuela is absurd. The Venezuelan government has released a lot of evidence in recent years of they've arrested these like random CIA operatives. Or at least the Venezuelan government said they were CIA operatives, and they've released some pretty strong evidence. Like, for instance, targeting Venezuelan infrastructure, trying to blow up Venezuelan power plants and oil fields. This has happened many times in recent years. So the CIA has obviously been active in Venezuela. But as part of this psychological war on Venezuela, Trump publicly confirmed that he authorized the CIA to carry out lethal operations, hinting, of course, they're going to try to assassinate President Maduro. So that's part of the psychological war, but I don't think that's going to work the Venezuelan government has already faced so many obstacles, so many attacks, so many threats. The psychological war element's not going to work. But if the US launches airstrikes or missile strikes and bombs military targets, bombs oil fields, like, that could actually cause serious chaos in Venezuela. And potentially the US would like to push Venezuela into a civil war. So I am very concerned. I mean, as someone like, I've been to Venezuela many times. I have a lot of friends there. Like, it's a beautiful country, a beautiful culture. Like, I'm very concerned. They've already suffered so much under these illegal US sanctions and a blockade. The US just wants to destabilize it and cause chaos and to lead to overthrow of the government. I mean, if you go back to 1960, the US State Department published an internal cable, which has now been declassified, about the US strategy in Cuba. And it admitted, this was a year after the Cuban Revolution in 1959, and a top US State Department official admitted that the Cuban revolutionary government led by Fidel Castro with, Ernesto Che Guevara was extremely popular. The majority of people supported it. They admitted, the State Department admitted this. Therefore, they concluded that the only way to destabilize it would be to cause extreme economic suffering. As Nixon and Kissinger famously said, when Chile elected a socialist president, democratically elected president, Salvador Allende, they said, we must make the economy scream. Well, a decade before, in 1960, the US State Department said the strategy should be to collapse the economy. And this is the exact quote. They said, quote, bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government, end quote. That's from the State Department. That's the strategy for Cuba, to destroy the Cuban economy, bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow government. It's the same thing in Venezuela. And that strategy has been going on for over a decade. It's failed. So now they're at the last resort, which is the military option. I mentioned that I don't think like a full-on invasion with thousands of troops is likely, but I actually do think airstrikes or missile strikes in Venezuelan territory are likely. And the New York Times has reported, interviewing people in the Trump administration, that is being very strongly considered. They say that there are 3 scenarios. One, according to the New York Times, interviewing Trump administration officials. One is that the strategy is using special operations forces, sending in teams to try to go in and kidnap and or kill Maduro. The other strategy is to send in troops to seize Venezuelan strategic infrastructure, including oil fields. They admitted that. So the U.S. troops would be literally occupying Venezuela's oil fields like they did in Syria. And the other option would be not as direct, but launch attacks and then try to target the Venezuelan military, to force the Venezuelan military to say it will no longer protect President Maduro, to force Maduro to flee to another country. But I mean, I think that's a pie in the sky idea. So I'm very concerned about what will happen in Venezuela. Last thing I'll say is that, I did an interview with a Chinese media outlet about this, and they asked me, they said, if you were forced to put a number to it, like what percentage likelihood do you think is of these outcomes? I said, well, if I were at gunpoint forced to pick a number, I would say, a 66% likelihood that there are like missile strikes or some kind of strikes directly in Venezuelan territory, not just in waters surrounding Venezuela. I mean, that's pretty likely, but there's still a 1/3 possibility it doesn't happen and that it's all bluffing. But then I said if I were forced to say like maybe 25% likelihood of an actual invasion with US troops, I do not think that's likely. But there's so much, like Marco Rubio, he wants to be president. Like, let's be real. JD Vance wants to be president. I think actually Rubio is more likely to be president than Vance. And Vance, Rubio, as evil as he is and Machiavellian, he's actually scarier to me than even Trump. Rubio is much smarter, and he's cunning, and he's a lifelong neoconservative war hawk, crazy hawk. He supported every war, and yet he's kind of rebranded himself as like a populist Republican, right? And he's actually popular among many Democrats, which is crazy. When Marco Rubio had his Senate confirmation hearing, it was 99 people voted in support of Marco Rubio. 99 voted. So like, so many Democrats are okay with Marco Rubio because he's seen as like this supposedly more moderate Republican because he's an old school neocon. And like, he wants to be president. And like, if he can pull this off, he will be the next US president. So there's no way that he's going to pass up this opportunity. He's going to do everything he can to accelerate the war in Venezuela.
That is a very, very concerning development. Thank you for making your time to talk to us. This is an evolving story, so I'm sure I'm going to have you back on the show to further explore this topic. The US-China competition is not going away, and it's just manifesting differently. Ben, if people want to follow your work, where would they go?
Yeah, just geopoliticaleconomy.com. And I want to thank you for having me, Carl. It's always a pleasure. Thanks for letting me rant about this stuff. I'll add one other quick note here. You use the term US-China competition, and I'm not criticizing you in any way. That's the term most people use. But, we're in a new Cold War, Cold War II. And it's really sad. I wish that weren't true. But I will say that, even some people here in Beijing, they have acknowledged this. I mean, like I talked to a lot of Chinese academics here who are influential. In China, universities are more influential than in the US, where the government just ignores academics. But here, the Chinese government, they actually take the advice of experts very seriously. And I've talked to some high-profile Chinese intellectuals, academics at top universities, and several of them have said, yeah, we're in a new Cold War. Although I remember one said to me, I won't name him, but he said, I prefer the term Cold War II because this Cold War is very different from Cold War I. So calling it a new Cold War makes it kind of seem like it's similar to the old Cold War. He says it seems very different, but there's a sense of kind of pessimism about US-China relations. And most people have recognized that the best they can do is minimize the harm and try to reduce the speed of escalation of tensions. But in the long term, things will only get worse. which means that unfortunately, I think, for the several decades that come in our lifetime, the next 40, 50 years, I think it's going to be a time of a lot of geopolitical conflict and more, unfortunately, I think we'll see even more and more kind of violent conflicts like during the first Cold War. So unfortunately, what we're talking about with Venezuela and all of this is, in my view, probably the beginning of a very dangerous moment in history.
Thank you for that very important clarification, because sometimes when people say U.S.-China competition, it almost seems China is like an equal participant in precipitating this confrontation, but actually it's a U.S.-led, U.S.-imposed Cold War 2.0. This is a confrontation that China does not want. Like President Xi Jinping said many times, the world is big enough for both U.S. and China to coexist. But that's not the mentality of the elite in Washington, because they only believe in the zero-sum competition. That means, for U.S. to be on the top or continue to rise, the other people must be pushed down. And this is why they're taking the Tanya-Hart approach of competition, try to kneecap everybody. But yeah, this is... it is what it is. And again, I have to say thank you for making your time. I can geek out on this for hours. I'll just, be quiet, turn off my mic, and listen to you. It's very elucidating on many of the topics, especially how you connect all the dots. So thank you again, Ben, for making the time to speak to my audience. And for the people watching, thank you. And until next time.